I use the word failure to their leaders. You, sir, are the failure, not the men and women who are on that front line. But if there's a lack of a winning strategy, they're in harm's way. Their leaders have failed them. And that's what's happening. We have political leadership. You don't have a strategy. You don't have a long-term plan to actually win this war. Win the war. The men and women are going to be able to do it, but they need to have leadership. When will you show leadership? When will you show leadership?
Why don't you show some leadership and stand up to your fellow Democrats who won't fund the troops?
For every American who cares about government accountability, this official Senate recording is a must-watch. Senator Gary Peters puts Secretary Pete Hegseth on the spot over $70 billion in requested funding and 30 unverified victory claims. Watch the moment Peters declares, "You, sir, are the failure." The actual footage begins right now.
Thank you to our witnesses here today. I want to begin by first echoing my colleagues' comments that we've heard throughout the hearing here and join them in mourning the loss of American service members who were killed in action these last few days. My thoughts are with their families, with a service member who remains missing, and with all those injured during the strikes. And I will continue to pray for their families. Secretary Hegseth, over the course of the war with Iran, I have repeatedly expressed concerns regarding the administration's lack of a winning strategy and repeated contradictions about the state of the war. It frankly doesn't help that you and your president continues to mislead the American people. You and the president have repeatedly said that the war, as we've heard over and over again, is almost over or already won. In fact, the president alone has said the war is almost over more than 30 times. On March 1st, the president said, we'll be done in 4 or 5 weeks. On March 9th, he said the war was very complete. On April 8th, he declared total and complete victory, 100%, no question about it. On the same day, you declared Operation Epic Fury was a historic and overwhelming victory on the battlefield, a capital V military victory by any measure. And yet today, July 21st, we have soldiers whose remains are sadly going to be returned to their deeply grieving families tomorrow. Clearly, the war is not over yet. After months of conflict, our strategy to win remains unclear. I have long said the United States has the strongest military in history in the world, and I have no doubt that our brave service members can execute any mission and prevail in any battle. But without a clear winning strategy, we're at risk of being in another forever war that'll put our service members in continued harm's way and continue to cost taxpayers billions of dollars. Secretary
What you just witnessed set a heavy tone in that room, but the most critical part of this hearing is starting right now. Senator Peters brought cold, hard receipts matching 30 past victory claims directly against a $70 billion request. He shifted the focus to real-world consequences, troop safety, taxpayers' dollars, and unresolved security risks. Watch what happens when Peters demands the unfiltered truth and backs the secretary into a corner with no room to hide. If you believe in government accountability, hit the like button, subscribe, and tell us below, how long can leadership avoid these direct questions?
Secretary Hegseth, despite your failure to win this war, you are back now before Congress asking for almost $70 billion in additional funding. You're asking the American people for a blank check because, once again, the Trump administration's efforts have been an utter and complete failure to win this war to this point. So my question for you, sir, is how is your strategy different than what we've seen in the past? So far, we have not seen a strategy that's been successful. You mentioned nuclear material is the primary goal of the war. It still exists. We haven't dealt with that issue yet. You talk about the destruction of missiles, and yet the missiles that we saw hit recent targets are actually somehow more lethal, more deadly, more maneuverable than what we have seen in the past. So they're obviously improving their munitions. The Strait of Hormuz is still closed, reminding everybody it was open before the war. Prices were lower for everybody until the war, and it still remains closed. And of course, tragically, people, service members, our warfighters, who we care deeply about, are still dying. So what's different? Mr. Hegseth, Secretary Hegseth.
I think your characterization of this incredible effort as a failure is reckless. And I think it's irresponsible. And I think it smears the sacrifice of the troops that are out there making on behalf of the American people to ensure that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon. Shame on you and others who call this a quagmire and a failure, and then you want to turn around and say you support the warfighter. Either you do or you don't.
Is the nuclear material still there,
I can
sir?
get you a ticket out to CENTCOM and talk to what those Americans are doing, and how committed they are to this effort, and how they want to ensure that Iran never threatens their families with a nuclear weapon. That's the kind of intensity that our warfighters have about making sure that Iran isn't capable of doing that.
Secretary Hegseth.
Notice what just happened. When asked directly about nuclear material, the Secretary offered a plane ticket to CENTCOM instead of an answer. He turned a factual question about strategy into an attack on patriotism. But Senator Peters was not letting him off the hook. Watch what happens next as Peters draws a firm line between our brave troops on the front lines and the political leadership failing them. If you demand real answers from Washington, hit the like button, subscribe, and tell us below, was that CENTCOM invite a genuine offer or an obvious dodge?
Capable of doing
Secretary
that.
Hegseth, if you listen to my comments, you would have heard me say how amazing our warfighters are.
I heard failure. And the word heard. I heard exactly
I will
what you
tell
said.
you how I use the
Heard
word
exactly
failure,
what you
because
said.
I use the word failure to their leaders. You, sir, are the failure, not the men and women who are on that front line, not the men and women who hold up their honor with distinction. But if there's a lack of a winning strategy, they're in harm's way. Their leaders have failed them. And that's what's happening. We have political leadership. You don't have a strategy. You don't have a long-term plan to actually win this war. Win the war. The men and women are going to be able to do it, but they need to have leadership. When will you show leadership?
We have leadership.
When will you show leadership?
Why don't you show some leadership and stand up to your fellow Democrats who won't fund the troops, who stand and play partisan politics while you don't give us the money? You want to stand up here and talk about the troops? You won't show any political
Secretary
courage
Hegseth.
to actually fund our department because you have Trump derangement syndrome and can't actually commit to anything meaningful. So I put this on you, Senator.
Secretary Hegseth, you have trillions, you have over $1 trillion. You're asking for $1.5 trillion. It's not a question of money. It's a question of leadership and understanding what it takes to actually win.
Political cowardice of Democrats who won't fund the troops.
Did you see how the actual question got completely buried? Senator Peters pressed for a winning strategy on a $1 trillion budget, and Hegseth responded by accusing him of a psychological disorder. When the head of the military resorts to personal attacks instead of accounting for troop safety and billions in spending, that isn't a policy disagreement. That reveals the reality of who is truly failing. Peters entered that room with a specific line of questioning that had been building for months. He is not a newcomer to defense oversight. He sits on the Senate Armed Services Committee and has spent years tracking military readiness, veterans programs, and defense contracts. He came prepared with a timeline of presidential statements, a list of unresolved battlefield objectives, and a direct question about strategy. That kind of preparation is exactly what congressional oversight is supposed to look like. The response he received wasn't a strategic answer. It was a complete shutdown. What Hegseth did in that room follows a pattern that has become recognizable in high-profile congressional testimony. When the substantive answer would be damaging, the witness pivots to the character of the questioner. Hegseth called Peters reckless and irresponsible. He invoked the sacrifice of the troops as a shield. He accused Democrats broadly of cowardice. None of those responses addressed a single factual question Peters had raised. Not the 30-plus presidential statements claiming victory, not the nuclear material, not the missiles that appeared to have improved capabilities, not the closed Strait of Hormuz, not the ongoing losses. Every specific was left hanging in the air, unanswered. Let's take a closer look at that CENTCOM moment. Hegseth's invitation to Peters to fly out and see the troops was framed as an act of patriotism, as though visiting the battlefield would somehow answer whether nuclear material had been secured. It would not. That is not how accountability works. A defense secretary appearing before the Armed Services Committee is not doing the country a favor by showing up. It is a legal obligation. The committee has the authority to demand answers, and when a senator asks whether the primary stated objective of a military conflict has been achieved, an offer to book a flight is not a response. It is a dodge. The money question deserves its own attention. Peters framed the $70 billion request as a blank check, and that framing was not rhetorical. When a military operation cannot demonstrate measurable progress toward its stated objectives, when the primary goal remains unresolved, when the conflict has produced improved enemy capabilities rather than degraded ones, and when the losses continue after multiple declarations of victory, then requesting tens of billions more without a revised strategy is not a funding request. It is an ask for unlimited confidence with no basis for that confidence. Peters also mentioned the $1.5 trillion total defense budget figure, which puts the $70 billion request in a context Hegseth did not engage with. The senator's point was not that the Pentagon lacks money. It was that money without strategic clarity does not produce victory. It produces more of what has already not worked. There is something else happening in that room that the back and forth does not fully show. The soldiers returning home under such tragic circumstances the next day were not an abstraction to Peters. He opened his remarks by specifically mentioning the service members affected by the conflict and the families who would grieve. That is the harsh reality behind this debate. Every political argument about strategy and funding ultimately comes down to those lives. Hegseth's accusation that Peters was smearing the troops by questioning leadership is, by any fair reading, a reversal of what Peters actually said. Peters drew a clear distinction between the service members, whom he praised explicitly and at length, and the political leadership directing their mission. That distinction is not a rhetorical trick. It is the core question of accountability in any military conflict. Are the people sending others into harm's way equal to the task? The "when will you show leadership" exchange, repeated twice without any answer, told its own story. When a question is asked and not answered twice in a row, and the response is instead a counterattack, the viewer is watching something real unfold, not political theater. Hegseth did not defend his strategy. He attacked the senator's motives. That tells you something about the strength of the defense available. There is a broader question this hearing raises that no one in that room said out loud. When does a military conflict cross the line from a difficult but strategically coherent effort into something that is continuing primarily because stopping it would require admitting that earlier declarations of victory were premature? That is not an easy question, and it does not have a clean answer, but it is the question that sits at the center of everything Peters was pressing on. If victory was declared in April, and the conflict is still producing American losses in July, then one of those two things is wrong. Either the April declaration was inaccurate, or the definition of victory being used is not the one the American people were given. Both of those possibilities carry serious consequences. The Strait of Hormuz remains the quietest part of this story and possibly the most consequential. It is not a distant maritime detail. When that waterway is closed, the price of energy goes up for every American who drives a car or pays a heating bill or buys groceries that were transported by truck. The connection is direct. Peters named it specifically, and Hegseth did not respond to it at all. That silence is itself an answer of a kind. Chair Collins closed the hearing precisely as Peters was mid-sentence making his final point about money and leadership. The abrupt end meant that Hegseth's last audible words in the official record of this hearing were political cowardice. That is the note on which it concluded. Not a strategy, not a plan, not a timeline. A political accusation directed at the opposition. Whether that was the intended message or simply what happened when time ran out, it is what the transcript preserves. What this hearing ultimately puts in front of the American public is a question about what oversight is supposed to accomplish. If a Secretary of Defense can appear before the Armed Services Committee, decline to answer specific factual questions about active military objectives, and redirect every challenge back at the senator's politics without consequence, then the function of that committee becomes something different from what it is supposed to be. Peters clearly believed he was doing exactly what oversight requires. Hegseth just as clearly had no intention of giving him the answers he was looking for. Instead of getting the transparency this hearing was supposed to provide, the public was left completely in the dark. At the end of a tense hearing, the cameras turn off, the senators leave, and the fundamental question remains untouched. When a government asks for another $70 billion without showing a path to victory, who actually holds them accountable? That's where you come in. Tell me in the comments, are you seeing strategic leadership here or just political survival? If you want raw, unedited oversight like this on your feed, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Thanks for watching.